Wonderful. We're just going to wait just a minute or two to watch our attendees jump in here, and then we'll get started right away. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our live virtual event with naturalists Daniel Mathews and Valerie Trouet. We are so excited to be here with these writers to talk trees, ecology, and climate change, which is an intersection for their books, Trees in Trouble from Daniel Mathews and Tree Story from Valerie Trouet. We are grateful to be here in this virtual space with our fellow Books in Common sponsoring stores, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Before we get to Daniel and Valerie, we wanted to point out a few things about this virtual space. We are recording this event and it will be viewable on booksincommonnw.com, as well as the Books in Common NW YouTube channel after the event concludes. There will be a link to buy your copy of both authors' books in the chat, and it'll reappear periodically. Just click on the logo of your favorite supporting store to fill your shopping cart with all of Daniel and Valerie's books to support them and Books in Common. If you have questions for either or both authors, just click the Q&A button down there on the bottom or on the top, depending on what device you're using. And we'll get to them as time allows. You can also see the questions that other folks have asked and upvote ones that you're particularly interested in. You're welcome to use the chat function or chat window there to the right as well, so that we can see more of what your interest is. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend you first try exiting and re-entering the webinar. If you can't get back in, we hope you'll visit the Books in Common NW YouTube channel, where we are streaming there live. We also recommend, if you're having trouble hearing, that you try headphones. Sometimes they're just a little bit better balanced for sound for these things. We would like to remind you that this is a shared creative space, that we want to remain safe for everyone, and ask that you be respectful of everyone who has joined us tonight. Offensive or inappropriate comments or questions will see the user dismissed from this space. I know a lot of Bozeman folks might recognize Daniel Mathews as the author of Rocky Mountain Natural History, and our folks tuning in from Oregon and Washington will recognize the natural history of the Pacific Northwest Mountains and the Cascade Olympic Natural History. During a career of learning and writing about the natural history of Western North America, he's backpacked far and wide, watched for fires from Desolation Peak Lookout, watched a 40-foot fir crash onto his family's house in a storm, and lived for years in a forest cabin without electricity, heating with firewood and writing by a kerosene lamp. He's joining us from Portland, Oregon this evening. Thanks, Daniel. Valerie is a paleoclimatologist who uses the rings in trees to study the climate over the past 2,000 years and how it has influenced ecosystems and human systems. She's a professor in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, born and raised in Belgium, where she received a PhD in bioscience and engineering. She's been a dendrochronologist for almost 2 decades, and her research focuses on the climate of the past and how it's influenced human history and ecosystems. She's used tree rings to study hurricanes, snowpack, wildfires, and the jet stream. Her research has brought her to sub-Saharan Africa, Siberia, the Californian Sierra Nevada, and the Balkans, where she was part of a team that found the oldest known living tree in Europe, which was 1,075 years old. So without further ado and all the tree love, I'd like to turn it over to Daniel first to tell us a little bit more about Trees in Trouble. Ray.
Thank you very much, Jessica and Three Bookstores. I'm honored to be sharing the stage with Dr. Trouet tonight. And I'm honored to be competing with the Republican National Convention. About that 40-foot tree crashing onto my house sounds a little bit like the 18-inch Stonehenge in Spinal Tap. This is Spinal Tap. It was a 4-foot diameter crashed onto my house. It was exciting. It was scary. Anyway, my book, Trees in Trouble, is one thing it is kind of it's a work of love about the West's pines, and especially the ponderosa pine forests, the way we want them to be again, the way they were for the pioneers. I love this description written by a couple of pioneers on the Oregon Trail in 1853. I got to jump from one end to the other, but our drive of the forenoon of September 8th was still among the pine openings. The atmosphere was loaded with balm, meaning fragrance. I can almost say I never saw anything more beautiful. The forest so different from anything I've seen before. The country all through is burnt over. So often there is not the least underbrush, but the grass grows thick and beautiful. It is now ripe and yellow, and in the spaces between the groves, which are large and many, looks like fields of grain ripened. Let's see if I can show you some pictures here. Share screen. Host Jessica, can you enable screen sharing?
Sure can. Sorry about that. I thought it was enabled. All right.
Yeah.
Will it let you know? There we go.
So this is a 1900 photo of one of those pine forests with plenty of space between the trees. And there aren't as many of those today as there used to be, but there are still quite a few, and foresters are working to get back to them using prescribed fire. I'm sure this stand in Central Oregon has had at least one prescribed fire. You can see a little bit of charring at the bottoms of the trees. When I began researching for this book, I went along on a field trip with Jerry Franklin, that's him on the right, with his golden retriever Strider and his sidekick Norm Johnson. They're two of the members of the Gang of Four who wrote the Northwest Forest Plan. And here's a demonstration that the Forest Service kindly did for the public near Camp Sherman, Oregon. They showed several different, slightly different management options. The point is that when the trees are sparse like that, they're much more resistant to fire. The fire leaves the big mature trees, it chars them a little bit, and then over the years, the charred surface pops off and the trees go back to their golden colors. And meanwhile, these the small brush and small trees that could grow up and provide ladder fuels to kill the big trees are removed most of the time, and that's what keeps the forests resilient to fire. Fire is, of course, something I talk about a lot in my book. This is a very recent photo from about 2 weeks ago. This is a fire tornado at the Royalton Fire on the California-Nevada border. And this is at the heart of one of the worst mega fires of the last 10 years, the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico, which was able to consume most of what was on the ground because the same area had burned just about 15 years earlier in another severe fire, leaving just young brush, young trees, which can be consumed in fire, and the old dead stuff, which is dry and can also be consumed in fire. So that's what it takes to get this sort of moonscape look. Here's a panorama of the same fire 9 years later. As you see, it's still not doing too well. And you can see one little patch over on the left-hand edge of standing tall green trees that survived. So fires are patchy, but this one, for the most part, was high severity. And it's these large high severity patches which are going to have a really hard time regenerating and becoming green forests again. This is in an even bigger megafire in central British Columbia in 2017. The Hanceville was more than 500,000 acres and thus bigger than any historic fire in the lower 48 states. And yet it was only half as big as the fire a short distance to its north in the same summer. My theory is that these lodgepole pines were steam bent by the heat of the fire and the winds that came through. Here's a picture. The little inset pictures are preventing you from seeing Bozeman, but it's over there and it's getting smoky. By this time of 2017, it was this smoke is largely from fires in Oregon and Washington. And it wasn't the biggest fire year in Washington. The two big years prior, 2015 and 16, were much worse. But here you've got the North Peak fire and the Jolly fire making little plumes of smoke blowing north. And here's a composite of about 20 years of fires on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, showing they do cover quite a lot of the area. Infestations of pine bark beetles. Bark beetles are another major topic in my book. This is in the height of the epidemic in 2015 in the Sierra Nevada. These are mostly ponderosa pines and sugar pines attacked by different species of bark beetles. This is what one tree looks like. The spaghetti patterns under the bark are left by mountain pine beetle, as is the blue stain fungus, which is characteristically brought by these beetles and makes the blue stains in the wood of the tree. Oops. I'll bet Dr. Trouet caught my error there. This would be western pine beetle, the one that attacks ponderosa pines more than mountain pine beetle and has the spaghetti-like pattern. And there's a picture of a pine beetle with its head blocked by the inset photos. It's about the size of a grain of rice. And here's Dr. Diana Six using an increment borer to take a core from a tree, which counts tree rings. Dr. Trouet has probably done about several 100,000 of these core samples over the course of her career. So I won't go into that too much. I'll leave that for her. And then I write a lot about what needs to be done, which includes a lot of prescribed fire and other techniques to thin the forests and get them back to that sparse condition where they're more resilient. This is a helicopter dragging a helitorch to set this prescribed fire. This is a drone being used by scientists from the Desert Research Institute to study prescribed fire. It's about to take off, and this is some of the imagery captured by drones over a prescribed fire. This imagery captures infrared as well as visible spectrum. The visible spectrum shows you those trees, and the infrared shows the heat plume rising from the fire. This is side-by-side photos about 60 years apart, showing the increase in density, which is characteristic of very much of the dry forests of the West over the years of fire suppression. And this is a little success photo from earlier this year from an actual very small wildfire in Central Oregon. It crossed this road. It went through both of these forests, but the forest on the right, which had been thinned by prescribed fire and thinning, most of the big trees survived, although their bases are charred. The forest on the left was overly dense because it had not had the prescribed fires, and most of its trees were killed, except perhaps those ones closest to the road, which perhaps got some water from firefighters, I'm not sure. In the southeastern US, they've carried on with the tradition of frequent prescribed fires year after year, decade after decade. It's totally accepted there, and they're keeping the forests the way they want them, which is like this. I also spend a few chapters talking about white bark pines. These are the typical ghost forests of dead white bark pines seen through the high mountains of the West. This is in central Oregon Cascades on North Sister, looking north at other Cascade volcanoes. And that's cankers of the white pine blister rust, the normally lethal exotic disease, which is threatening white bark pines as well as other 5-needle pines. And this is the hope for the future for 5-needle pines. A nursery which is trying to find the trees that have the most resistance to blister rust. So I did a little afterward, sort of an epigraph, what's the word? Epilogue to my story. I visited the car fire in Redding, California, this one, and the campfire in Paradise. And one interesting sign of hope I saw in Paradise, California, which is pertinent this week when fires have been going through a grand old redwood forest in California. There's been a lot of back and forth on Twitter about whether all the redwoods are dead or not. This is a young redwood which was completely defoliated in Paradise, California. 11 months later, it had completely resprouted both at the base and from the branches and trunk. So redwoods do show a lot of resilience. So that'll do for my introductory talk, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Trouet.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Do you want to stop? Yeah, there you go, your screen share. I'll talk like this without a screen for a little bit, and then maybe I'll show some photos like Daniel did towards the end. But yeah, so my name is Valerie Trouet, and I am a dendrochronologist, and I wrote this book. It's called Tree Story, History of the World Written in Rings. And I started writing this book in 2017 when I was on a sabbatical. And the way it came about is that I was actually approached by my editor at Johns Hopkins University Press, which ended up publishing the book. I got an email out of the blue, so the timing was good because I had just started my sabbatical. And she sent me an email saying, hey, I heard about your work in dendrochronology. Would you be interested in writing a broad audience book about dendrochronology and about your research? And my first gut reaction was like, that book is written already. Surely that exists. Dendrochronology, tree ring science, it's such an accessible science, right? Many people, I'm sure people attending or watching this recording, most of you probably as kids have learned that, you know, trees form a ring every year, and that by counting the rings, you can thus get an idea of how old a tree is. But few people actually know that there's a whole field of science based on this fairly straightforward concept. I should say, Jessica introduced me as being a professor in the laboratory of tree ring research. And so just to say that at the University of Arizona, the laboratory of tree ring research, it's a department of its own. There are 14 of us, 14 faculty members who all study tree rings for a living. So to get back to the origin story of my book, my first reaction was surely that exists. And then I started thinking about it and couldn't come up with a good, accessible, broad audience book about the dendrochronology, the science of tree rings. And so I said, yes, I agreed to write a book about tree rings for a broader audience, and that's what this now. It's finally 3 years later. It's after blood, sweat, and tears. It's been published, and one thing, looking at Daniel's presentation and being reminded. So I'm a chronologist, but I focus on climate. So I use the rings in trees to study the climate of the past. That's most of the work I do. I also look at wildfires and other aspects, but mostly the climate of the past. And so being a dendroclimatologist or someone who studies climate change, it can be depressing and frustrating at times. And so when I was asked to write this book, and while I was on sabbatical, I decided I did not want to spend my entire sabbatical thinking and reading and writing about climate change and about how dire the situation is that we're in. So instead, I wanted to write about that other side of being a scientist. I love being a scientist. It gives me the opportunity to create new knowledge, to discover new things. And there's such beauty in that. It's so enjoyable to discover things. And that's, I feel it's not always communicated to the broader audience how exciting science can be. And so that's what I aim to do with this book. And tree rings lend themselves to that purpose very well, because there's so much that we can tell, and so much discoveries that we've done using tree rings, so far reaching. And there's such good stories in tree rings. So we use tree rings not just to study the climate of the past like I do, but obviously to study forest history, fire history, but also human history. We can use tree rings to date shipwrecks, to date musical instruments, to look at the relationship between climate and human societies, to look how climate has influenced the Roman Empire or Genghis Khan, to look how vice versa, how people have influenced fire regimes in the past as well. So that's, I cover a lot of ground in my book. I talk about what it's like to be a scientist, about the pranks that my colleagues have inflicted on me at times, about what it's like to be in the field, what it's like to collaborate, what it is like to discover things and to go through the process of doing that. But I also talk about the results, about the exciting things that we have found using tree rings. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I had some slides lined up, but I can show them some other time. So maybe Jessica, I'll give it a word back to you.
Wonderful. Well, I feel like there's sort of a strange convergence of time as we've seen sort of a rather early beginning to the fire season here in the West. And I'm curious if both of you might like to address sort of why that keeps getting earlier, and the different influences that are impacting the fires that are going on right now in California. And I know there's some in Idaho and Colorado and all over.
I can start if you want to. Maybe you can chime in, Daniel. But yeah, there's the fire season is getting longer, and that's mainly due to climate change. On the one hand, it's getting warmer, and so it's getting drier, because drought is not just a factor of how much precipitation there is, but also of how warm it is, how hot it is. So hotter droughts create forests that are drier and that are more susceptible to wildfires. On the other hand, a lot of precipitation in the West falls as snow, and as your springs get warmer, your snowpack's gonna melt down sooner and create these drier conditions earlier as well. In terms of the factors that are at play, specifically in California, in the current fire conundrum that we're in, I think there's really three main factors. One of them is the climate change that I was talking about. The second factor is what Daniel demonstrated beautifully in his first photos, the fact that we've lost that park-like forest structure through a century of fire suppression. And now we have these dense undergrowth, understories in the forests that create very dangerous fire conditions. The third factor, I think, for humans is that the wild and urban interface is increasing. So that that means that more and more people are living closer and closer to the forest border and in the forest, meaning that when now a forest fire hits, you can't just let it burn and do its thing, but you have it's more destructive to humans and human livelihoods as well. Daniel, would you like to add to that?
No, that was very good. I would have just said most of the same things. And I guess in recent years, all the terrible fires in California of the last few years were mostly in the fall, when they get their onshore winds blowing hard and steady westward, mostly toward the ocean. This year is a little freakish in that regard, and that I think that the scientists were probably forecasting that there was likely to be a bad fire season this fall in California, and there may still be. There could be fires of that type, just as bad as the ones they're seeing now, all over again in October, when they do get those Santa Ana and Diablo winds. But California also this month got something pretty unusual, which I don't think we can particularly attribute to climate change. It just happens every once in a while, but they got some storms with a lot of lightning. So whereas most big fires in California in recent decades have been human started, whereas in British Columbia, it's mostly lightning started, and in Montana, Washington, in between, it's some of each, maybe a little more toward the lightning side in Montana, a little more toward the human side in Oregon and Washington. But California this year, they got a lot of lightning, and so they got these current fires. And it just overwhelms the firefighting system. I mean, they're not set up to fight 700 fires at once, which is what they got thanks to 700 lightning strikes on this very, very dry forest.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there's also a relationship between the increase in the sick trees. You showed the photo of the beetle blight and some of the spreads of those other pests or foreign contaminants coming to the trees. How is the climate change impacting the beetle life and how those trees are being affected by the beetles?
It seems to affect them quite a lot. The mountain pine beetle, the one that is responsible for the epidemics of the 20-aughts in Colorado and Wyoming and Montana and British Columbia, it's able to reproduce much faster with longer warm seasons, and it's able to go farther north. Like it invaded a whole new part of central British Columbia that had basically been outside of its range previously because it was too cold. The winters were too cold up there, and they no longer are. So that's a huge factor. And also the way that, as Valerie said, heat makes drought because it makes evaporation go faster. So the soil is drier and the trees are drier and the foliage is drier, and that stresses the trees, and the higher stress level makes it harder for them to produce their normal defenses against bark beetles, which mostly consist of pitch. So that was almost certainly a pretty big factor in the California bark beetle epidemics of 2015. It peaked in 2015, and that was the third year of the driest 3-year spell in recorded California history.
Why do you think, because you mentioned in the Southeast that they've been doing the prescribed burn and have seen a lot of success for that. Why do you think that the Greater West has been more reticent to adopt some of those policies? Where do you think that kind of disconnect comes from?
I'm not sure, but when the disconnect happened was around 1910, when the West had its worst fire year ever, mostly Idaho and Montana. And there was already at that point a debate in forestry circles between traditionalists who believed in prescribed fire, having learned it from the Native Americans, and so-called scientific foresters who were learning forestry, especially from Europeans who had not really had very natural forests to deal with for many, many human generations. And these big fires in 1910 were so terrible and killed so many people and so many trees that it sort of swung the debate over toward Smokey the Bear, although Smokey wasn't actually invented till 30 years later, 20 years later, but at any rate, it swung the debate over toward fighting fires. And maybe because that was in the West, and because it was in the West that these debates had been going on, and maybe those Southeasterners were just stubborn and not paying attention much to what was happening in the Northwest, so they didn't care and carried on with their prescribed burning as Pappy had taught them to.
I maybe want to add that, like, I'm in the Southeast at the moment, and humidity here is very high. So maybe here in the Southeast, the risk of a prescribed fire getting out of hand and burning much more than what was intended is lower than it might be, or the perceived risk at least, than it might be in the West. And so the feeling of high risk with starting a fire intuitively might be, people might feel less, might feel that it's less risky when they do it here in the Southeast versus in a dry forest in the West. That might be part of it as well.
Valerie, I'm curious if you might share with us some of the human impact that you've seen on the climate of the past and how you are seeing that in these tree stories.
So it's interesting. I've mainly looked at it the other way around, how past climatic changes have influenced past human societies, whether past, so pre-industrial human impacts, whether human impact has been strong on past climate pre-industrial times. That's a point of quite heavy debate in scientific circles. But so I've mostly looked at, so with tree rings, we can reconstruct the climate actually very precisely to the exact year. In the past, we can say for each year over the past, for instance, 2,500 years in Europe, which ones are the dry years, which ones are the wet years, which ones are the hot years, and which ones are the cold years. And so that annual precision, the fact that we have a data point for each year, allows us to compare it quite directly to human history. And again, for instance, in Europe, where we have a long history of written records, we can, for instance, look at whether climatic changes in the past have influenced, for instance, the fall of the Roman Empire, or if you go towards a beautiful study done by some of my colleagues, they use tree rings to reconstruct drought in Mongolia. And when you look at the period in the early 12th century when Genghis Khan came to rise and build up his empire, it turns out that's one of the wettest periods over the past 800 years. And that wet period allowed him to feed his cavalry and to basically rule the world at that time. But the main thing I've learned in looking at how climate is linked to human history sometimes empires fall through climate change, sometimes they rise through climate change, and how societies react to climate change is a much more important factor than the climate change per se in whether they're going to make it or not. So that's, I think, an important lesson to learn with what's going on now.
Excellent. I'm curious. So a lot of times when I talk with fiction writers, I ask them, what's a story or a piece of the pie that didn't actually make it into the book? And it sounds like there are so many fascinating tree stories. I'm curious if there was a tree story that didn't make it into the book that you might share with us.
That's a bit of an unexpected question. I'm sure I can think, actually, there's one, but this is, so I also have personal field work stories in the book, and I talk about Siberia and about Africa, but I've done quite a bit of field work in the Sierra Nevada in California, looking at wildfires of the past. And there's one field story there that I didn't include. And so when I was working in California, I was, I would go to the forest and look for stumps that were fire scarred, and maybe I can show some photos later on. But this, so you mentioned I'm from Belgium originally. I came to the US to do a postdoc at Penn State. This is when I did that California work. So here's this girl coming straight out of Belgium. The concept of wilderness does not exist in Belgium. It's a very, very densely populated country. So they dropped me in the Sierra Nevada in California in the middle of the national forest. It's just me and my rental car going through the forest looking for tree stumps. And so some of the people I stayed in the Forest Service fire barracks at night. And they warned me, they had a little fun with this Belgian girl. They warned me like, oh, if there's mountain lions here and there's bears here, and if you hear a mountain lion, you need to do this. You need to make yourself very big. But if you hear a bear, you need to stand very still and lie on the ground or something like that. I don't remember. Anyway, at some point, I'm in the middle of the forest, about like 100 yards away from my car, all by myself, and I hear this super loud roar very close by. I panicked and I didn't know what it was. Like, it was a loud roar. I don't know if it's a mountain lion or a bear. So first I stand still, I make myself very big, and then I realize, no, wait, that must have been a bear. So then I start running, and as I run towards my car, I think, no, I think it's a mountain lion after all. So I stand still again, and I start making myself very big again. Anyway, nothing happened. I never found out whether it was a mountain lion or a bear, but I'm very happy that no one saw me running through that forest and making all of these you see me all doing it now, so I guess it's not that crazy after all. But yeah, that was quite the experience to spend so much time in the forest. It was wonderful.
Well, I feel like the trees will keep that secret too.
Well, it's out now, so.
Daniel, was there something that struck you as you were?
What I was starting to say, just because I love camping and backpacking so much, it was great for me to read and imagine you as this European with no concept of wilderness going to the Sierra Nevada for the first time. And
yeah, it was wild.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, I was curious if there was a story or the story of a place that maybe didn't make it into Trees in Trouble that you might share with us.
Hey, I should have been thinking about that as soon as you asked Valerie. Let's see.
It's not a test.
Well, sequoias. I did in these few years, I did make a point of going to see the sequoias in the southern Sierra Nevada, and they're interesting, and they kind of fit because because they all are also adapted to frequent low severity fire. And in fact, they don't even make seedlings except when a fire has just come through. And the caretakers of Sequoia National Park were getting pretty worried that they hadn't seen seedlings for as long as they'd been alive, the humans. But then kind of for other reasons, they figured out about the fire ecology and they started doing prescribed fires, and presto, seedlings started coming out. So that was the problem. And so yeah, I would have loved to include sequoias. They're amazing. And they are just in the last year, there started coming out a number of stories. And I have talked with Nate Stevenson, who people usually talk to about sequoias. And when I talked to him, he wasn't really seeing this yet, but since then they've started to see some drought-related mortality of a few sequoias, which is a new thing and is pretty scary. So that's something that didn't go in just because I decided to limit the tree to pines. Have to draw a boundary somewhere, or this just gets encyclopedic.
Or you lose the forest for the trees. Sorry, it was a struggle as I was describing this event for promotion and things, not to just completely devolve into tree puns. So thank you for bearing with me. As a reminder to our viewers, feel free to drop any questions that you have for Valerie or Daniel in the Q&A button, top or bottom of your screen, depending on your style of screen. But to sort of circle back to something that you mentioned prior in talking about the Southwest or Southeast, excuse me, and how they had observed some of these fire management and forest caretaking practices from the indigenous inhabitants of the area. I'm curious if there are other practices here in the West that we've seen with care of the ecosystem. A favorite book of mine talks a lot about the harvesting of sweetgrass and how important it is to actually pick the grass to have a healthy population. And so I'm curious if there are other ways in which those stories get braided together, humans and trees.
Cedar trees, since I'm in the Northwest, I'll have to talk about Northwest coast culture, where cedar trees are incredibly central and important. And it was a really interesting study, which probably came from dendrochronology or involved it somehow, that when they figured out that that Western red cedars basically came into the Northwest coast region around 6,000 years ago, which meant you would have started getting a fair number of really big ones by around 5,000 years ago. And that was when Northwest coast culture began to flourish, when they started to be able to make everything out of cedar, including mortuary poles, commonly known as totem poles, and including their big houses, and everything, almost all their materials, diapers from cedar. And so that was one of the most interesting stories in my, prehistorical stories in my natural history of the Pacific Northwest. That was when Northwest coast culture became such a famously rich culture, where they could afford to build their personal power and prestige by giving everything away in potlatches, because they were basically a pretty rich culture.
So you've mentioned the sequoia, you've mentioned the cedar. I'm curious, as we see some of these really terrible burn scars and things like that take up more of the forest space, if there are new kinds of trees that, or new organisms that are moving into that space and trying to kind of capitalize on the disappearance of the pines. And if there's hope for maybe a different kind of forest.
Basically, at the southern edge of forest, at the dry edge of forest, pines is pretty much what you get, and junipers. So there may be a few pinon, pine, and juniper forests in the Southwest which turned to just juniper for a while. I'm not sure anyone's really excited about that. And in Colorado, and there's been a lot of gnashing of teeth about sudden aspen decline throughout a lot of the West, up to Alberta even. And this is something that's happening because of climate change. At the drier edges of aspen habitat, they are dying out. On the other hand, where some other kinds of trees have been badly attacked by bark beetles, especially the Engelmann spruce in Colorado, and to some degree the lodgepole pines a decade earlier in Colorado and Wyoming, we are seeing aspens able to take over in some of those places. So I wouldn't count aspen out. I think there may be at least as much aspen 30 years from now as there is now, even though it'll disappear from some dry edges. It's also expanding in Alaska at the cold edge of possible aspen habitat. At least in some places it is. But other than that, I don't see a lot of really of conversions from pines to other kinds of trees. It's more likely to be to grassland and brush. If there's a conversion away from pine forest.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you mentioned earlier, Valerie, about sitting down after being approached to write this story and being kind of distraught or at least disturbed by a lot of those climate change messages and the direness of the situation. I'm curious if you found any notes of hope.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually gonna pick up on where Daniel left off, in that trees are magnificent creatures, also because they are our natural mechanism of capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the problem that we are causing by burning fossil fuels and increasing the amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, trees help us to by taking that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, and then actually storing it in their trunk. So keeping those trees alive as long as we can is key to solving the issue of climate change. And also their treeing research can really contribute in understanding, and that's an active field of research as well, understanding which trees capture how much carbon, how long do they keep that carbon on the landscape. And I think one exciting avenue for the future is that if you think of, so it's, as treeing scientists, we work not only with living trees, but we can look at the rings of really a lot of things that are made of wood. That's why there are applications of dendrochronology in archaeology and in art history. But if you think, for instance, of a building, or for instance, let's think of the American Southwest, or the Four Corners region, where we have been able to date Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, all of the ancestral Puebloan ruins. The beams that they use to build their great houses and their kivas, those beams have captured carbon as well at their time, and 1,000 years later that carbon is still stored in that wood of those ruins, of those buildings. So we can think of not just as the trees don't need to be alive for the carbon to be kept out of the atmosphere. So if we can think of ways to build sustainably, to manage our forests sustainably, and to make the best use of it's a building material, right? We want carbon as a building material. We don't want it up in the atmosphere. So I think if we are creative enough, there are a lot of things that we can do, and that gives me hope. I like thinking about solutions.
Yes. Well, we have a question from the audience. They say, you talk about other disciplines you need to collaborate with to mitigate issues. Could you talk about that and perhaps how to convince policymakers? And I might add on to that. I feel like when we started talking about climate change when I was very small, it was, recycle and all of these other kinds of things. And as we look at forest fires and this overarching kind of behemoth monster of climate change, are there small things that everyday people can do to help the health and safety of our forests?
I can talk about climate change generally, but maybe if you're talking about forests specifically, Daniel, do you want to take this on?
Well, if you happen to own some forests, I recommend programs of if they're of the dry type of forest. This, of course, doesn't apply in my neck of the woods, Western Oregon, where all those generalizations about overly dense forests needing to be thinned, they don't really apply here. It's different here. But anyway, if you have a ponderosa pine type or arid forest, then absolutely get into managing it with prescribed fire. And also look into planting trees. If you have land that can be planted in trees, look into seed sources from farther south where they're better adapted to the warmer climate, which they will get. And even different, actually in favor of some foresters are not, but I'm in favor of different species from farther south a lot of the time. A few people have asked me lately what's good in Northern Oregon, and I think incense cedar might be good. But for the rest of us who don't own a lot of land to manage, I think I've got to say that how you vote and how you participate in public meetings and communicate to your policymakers is probably more what's needed than small changes in your everyday lifestyle.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. We're in a pandemic. That's why we're unfortunately not in your bookstore, but here online. A lot of travel has been stopped. A lot of for a long time, a large part of the world has been put to a stop or at least for personal travel. Yeah, the impact of all of that, of months and months of heavily reduced air travel and car travel on carbon emission is minimal. It's a blip. You barely notice it. So what, I mean, obviously it's not the most efficient way of bringing down our carbon emissions by just stopping the world. But what that tells us is that we need much more than personal commitments, than personal investments in reducing our personal carbon footprint. That's important as well, but it is by far not enough. We need policymakers to make big decisions in terms of climate change. And unfortunately, in the United States at this moment, we're not doing that. And so I fully agree with Daniel that the most important choice that you can make as an individual in terms of addressing climate change is to vote, and to vote for policymakers who are concerned about climate change. Because make no mistake, climate change is not only about forests and about nature. It's above all about humans, and it's humans who are going to be, if we continue going the way we are going, humans are going to have a hard time. Not just trees are going to be in trouble, but humans are going to be in trouble as well.
We have another question. Did you have something to add, Daniel?
Just kind of an amen.
Indeed.
Sorry, I preach a bit sometimes.
We need it.
That's good.
Another question. I often hear about tree planting initiatives, but they often appear to focus solely on just a few or only one tree species. Are there initiatives exploring companion planting, restoring multiple tree species along with appropriate understory species to help retain water and rebuild soil?
I'm sure that can be done. Keep looking. I don't have any information off the top of my head about that, but certainly I think the complaint about planting monocultures is based on what industrial forestry has done, what over the last 80 years, what mostly the industrial forest owners have done. They've planted monocultures. And I think even they are starting to see that that was a mistake. And certainly the Forest Service, somewhat before that, was seeing that it was a mistake. And they have been moving toward more diversity and homogeneity in the forest landscape. And initiatives, if they're initiatives from nonprofit organizations, are going to be even better, probably. So Nature Conservancy, I'm sure you can find some who are doing that.
Yeah, I don't know any examples in the US or in the American West, but there's a really nice example from an initiative like Daniel was talking about in the Sahel, actually, in Northern Africa, or Northwestern Africa, the Green Wall of Northwestern Africa, where they started planting, so afforestation, planting new forest, a mix of species, and then working with the local communities to actually, because planting, relatively speaking, planting trees is easy. It is keeping those trees alive and managing the forest that is hard. And so if you want to plant a large forest in the African Sahel, you're gonna need the support of local communities. So I think that is, as far as I know, one of the most successful stories that way, that people, as well as the economy, as well as the local climate even, is improved by fairly large scale afforestation projects.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we covered a lot because I don't have any more questions. So I might end us there. But it was so delightful to speak with you all. Do check out Books in Common Northwest to pick up your copy of Tree Story or Trees in Trouble. I actually just noticed on the back of the jacket is a blurb from one of our fellow Montana indie bookstores in Missoula, Fact and Fiction. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you are interested in more Books in Common events, you can find those on booksincommonnw.com, along with the purchase links to purchase your copy of Daniel and Valerie's books. So you can show your support for them this evening, as well as Books in Common. And let's all get out and vote to save our forests.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Both of you.
Same here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it and very much enjoyed it. Hang in there.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.